It's the 1920s. A guy by the name of Felix Wankel designed a totally different type of rotary compressor. First, getting a patent for this particular rotary design in 1934, when he had an epiphany realizing that he could add intake and exhaust ports to it, essentially turning it into an internal combustion engine. Fast forward to 1951, Felix would work for NSU, which was a German manufacturer that produced bicycles, motorcycles, and automobiles, founded in 1873, and would eventually get bought out by the Volkswagen Group in 1969. Anyway, Felix would work for NSU. His mission was to design a rotary compressor as a supercharger unit for NSU motorcycles. Wankel would have a completed rotary engine design in 1954, but for whatever reason, it wasn't tested until 1957 for the very first time. 4 prototypes were said to have been produced. They were tested from engine speeds from 17,000 to 25,000 RPM, but at 25,000 RPM, there were distortion issues with the outer rotor case. It's important to note that there are 2 primary forms of piston rotary engine, DKM. There are 2 rotors, the inner trochoid-shaped rotor and an outer rotor, which has an outer circular shape, the inner figure 8 shape. The center shaft is stationary and torque is taken off of the outer rotor, which is geared to the inner rotor. And the second primary form is KKM. The outer rotor is part of the housing and is stationary. The inner shaft is moving as the rotor spins around it, almost like a hula hoop fashion. Torque is taken from the eccentric shaft. NSU wasn't a huge company and they couldn't afford to build 2 different designs, so they decided to go all in on the KKM design because torque was taken from the eccentric shaft, much like a piston engine with the crankshaft, so it was easier to hook a transmission up to it. It's important to note that the early engines did suffer from problems such as the seals, the appendix. They were huge weaknesses. Also, between the rotor and the housing, carbon particles could become trapped between the seal and the casting and would jam, requiring a total engine rebuild. 500cc or 30.3 cubic inch displacement single rotor. It produced anywhere from 50 to 64 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, 54.25 pound-feet or 73.55 newton meters at 3,000 RPM. It was water-cooled. Years this engine was produced was 1964 through 1967 and could be found in the NSU Wankel Spider. Wankel would follow up with a twin rotor design at 1000cc or 61 cubic inch displacement, twin rotor 1 liter. It produced anywhere between 115 to 130 horsepower, 5,500 RPM, 112 pound-feet or 152 newton meters at 4,500 RPM with a compression rating of 9 to 1. This engine was used in the NSU RO 80 and it was produced from 1967 through 1977. You have to realize the Wankel engine was the cutting edge, and because of that, it showed so much promise that a lot of companies rushed to license the Wankel rotary engine. Companies like, but not limited to, Porsche, who would use the RO 80 twin rotor engine in a 914 with the radiator up front, but this was more of a one-off 914. Alfa Romeo also looked into this engine. They wanted to reinvent the wheel with this engine. Block materials going from graphite. It worked just about as well as you would think, and then they just used cast iron. Alfa ended up doing 2 test mules with the rotary engine. They used a Spider with a single rotor and a 1750 4-door sedan, which they called the 4-door saloon car with a twin rotor. Alfa being a small company, they only made 2 prototypes before throwing the towel in. This one might shock you, but AMC, American Motor Corporation, wanted to use the Wankel engine for their new fishbowl car, the Pacer, which was designed by Dick Teague. AMC had huge plans for their urban concept car. They wanted front-wheel drive and powered by a Wankel rotary engine. AMC signed a licensing agreement through Curtiss Wright to build Wankel rotary engines. AMC wanted to use the power plant in cars as well as their Jeep line. AMC decided to just cut Curtiss Wright out of the equation and just purchase the motors from General Motors, who was developing a Wankel engine for their cars. General Motors would cancel development in 1974 for various reasons, durability issues. These motors drank fuel. It wasn't ideal in a fuel crisis, totaling costs to build the engines. General Motors essentially pulled the rug out from under AMC. The Pacer had to be completely redesigned to accept a 6-cylinder engine. Speaking of General Motors, in 1970, General Motors paid $50 million for the initial license to build their own Wankel engine. Ed Cole, who was General Motors president at the time, thought they could have their version ready in 3 years' time. 3 of the greatest engineers to ever work at General Motors worked on this thing. I'm talking Pete Estes, John DeLorean, and Ed Cole himself. Their target date was October 1973, and they wanted to premiere it in the Chevy Vega. General Motors' design had 2 rotors with a displacement of 206 cubic inch displacement, 3.38 liters, twin distributors, 2 coils with an aluminum housing. General Motors was able to make the engines reliable with a lifespan of 530,000 high revving miles. But they couldn't get past the emissions and bad gas mileage. General Motors didn't want to face the gas mileage criticism that Mazda went through. Ed Cole would pull the plug in 1974 and would retire that same month. Pete Estes would take Ed Cole's place as president of General Motors. Nissan/Datsun. Datsun was Nissan's foreign make, so if the company didn't do so well, Nissan wasn't associated. Anyway, Datsun was interested in the mid-60s, and they were going to go with a twin rotor design, 2 plugs per rotor, 4-barrel carburetor, aiming at 120 horsepower. It was going to go into the Datsun Sunny RE, but just like everything else, it fell through around 1973. It only went into 1 prototype. Rolls-Royce even got on the Wankel bandwagon, but they did it with a twist. And we might come back and do a whole episode on this one because it is a weird concept. Rolls-Royce design would burn diesel fuel, and it was a twin rotor design, but with 2 different rotor sizes. The bottom rotor was larger than the top rotor. The top rotor was smaller. The large rotor fed unburned fuel to the smaller top rotor. This engine made a mystical or theoretical 350 horsepower. 4 prototypes are said to have been made before Rolls-Royce decided to pull the plug. Suzuki would even use the rotary engine on a motorcycle, the Suzuki RE5 with a single rotor. It was only produced for a very short window in time, 1974 through 1976. 2 models were available, 1975 the Model M, and in 1976 the Model A. 6,000 RE5s were produced from 1974 through 1976. Kawasaki went down sort of the same road as Suzuki with putting a rotary engine on a motorcycle, but instead of 1 rotor, they would use 2 rotors on their prototype X99. Honda built a prototype Wankel engine for a motorcycle, but their version was air-cooled, 125cc single rotor unit, but only built 1 prototype between the years of 1971 through 1973. Mazda was the most successful Wankel engine manufacturer. Mazda got interested in the Wankel engine sometime in the late 60s, making displacements from 360cc all the way up to 2616cc with single rotor, twin rotor. They even made turbocharged rotary engines. Mazda is still making rotary cars to this very day, which leads us to the latest pursuer of the Wankel engine, Toyota. But it's worth mentioning, Toyota got their license clear back in the 70s to produce a Wankel engine, and their goal in the 70s was to produce an engine that produced between 75 and 150 horsepower. But just like most others, it fell through. But now they are planning to make a rotary engine range extender for their electric vehicles. Audi is also going down the route of the rotary electric range extender. Other companies that made rotary engines include, but not limited to, Citroën, Ford, Daimler-Benz, Norton, Yamaha, Hercules, Veen. Also, the rotary engine was used in aircraft applications, trains, watercraft, go-kart, power units, generators, lawnmowers. This was to be the next best thing, but just like everything else, there were pros and cons to the concept. On the positive side, small, compact unit weighed less, fewer moving parts, cheaper to produce, high revving, unique sounding engine, high power to weight ratio, no engine vibration, no engine knock, adaptable to other fuels such as diesel and hydrogen. But on the cons, the Wankel engine suffered from thermodynamics, thus having a low efficiency rating with a maximum efficiency rating, some people say 30%, which isn't good. Seals were a common main concern, fuel thirst, and emissions. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather. And this Would You Rather is a bit different. Out of all of the rotary engines that were proposed, which one would you have liked to succeed? The Rolls-Royce engine looks super interesting. It's almost like a figure eight design with a small rotor on top and a larger rotor on the bottom. 350 horsepower for that unit. That's pretty good. But which one would you guys have liked to see succeed in the comment section below? Maybe it was one we talked about today. Maybe it was one that we didn't talk about today. All right, now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below. I try to run the most transparent car YouTube channel on the platform where I answer all the questions. I don't say that for self-worth. I just say that if you take the time to write a comment, I will take the time to read it. Also, just want to thank all of our subscribers. And if you want to subscribe, you totally can. This is way more than a car channel. This is a car community that I am very much a part of. Thank you all so much for making it that. Also, which engines would you like to see featured on Engine Episode Wednesdays? Leave it in the comment section below. If we've already covered it, I will link it with your comment. Until next time, toodaloo!